To say the inaugural season of the Toronto Blue Jays had its ups and downs would be a misnomer because it was mostly downs with a few ups. Now, for a little bit of background, Toronto was scheduled to get a franchise from San Francisco just a few months previous to the American League deciding to take on Toronto and the Seattle Mariners as part of their what do you call multi-divisional lineup. The Giants were basically bankrupt, but the city of San Francisco came up with enough support and money to stop the Giants from moving to Toronto and for them to get a franchise. Now, Toronto had been prevalent in minor league ball for a number of years. Everybody from Babe Ruth to Tom Lasorda to Sparky Anderson and Dick Williams had played in either Toronto or Montreal, minor league teams. But it just seemed Toronto was destined to get a franchise. It was a good fit because Detroit was across the way. Canada was baseball hungry, going back to the old Jackie Robinson Montreal Royals team, Expos in '69. There were some hopes that the Blue Jays would be put in the National League, but unfortunately, when San Francisco fell apart, um, they put them in the ever evil AL East at the time, which, to my memory, had probably the greatest divisional lineup for any sports division in history. Not even NHL, England leagues, overseas can compare to the strength of the AL East. You had Yankees, Red Sox, Orioles, Brewers, Red Sox, tremendous division. Detroit, and let me tell you, it was a hard go, especially after the first month. There was some promise. Now, in the preseason, Toronto had some success. They were building up on some name players like Bill Singer, Rico Cardi, uh, Jerry Johnson, Ron Fairley, Hector Torres, Rick Cerrone. But it seemed like they were going to start the season hopefully living off some of the rejects from the Indians, the Yankees, the Red Sox, Oakland A's to start the season. We didn't know how everything was going to go, but the biggest rumor we heard as young children is that Bill Singer was looking to be the face of the franchise, the former no-hit pitcher for from 1970. Singer had signed with the Blue Jays, but it was an offer from the Yankees to give up Ron Guidry of all people. Can you imagine Ron Guidry as a Blue Jay, but Blue Jays president Peter Bavasi, who was part of the great Bavasi baseball family, um, vetoed the deal, and Singer ended up being the opening day starter in a famous snow game where Toronto rebounded from an early deficit of 4-1 to win 9-5 with the ever steady Doug Ault and Elvis Woods getting home runs, and George Brett's brother actually took the loss in the game with Jerry Johnson getting the win and Vukovic the save. Now, Toronto at the time had a very nondescript lineup, but despite this, they finished off their first homestand at 5-2, which actually put them in first place for that part of the season, and were ahead by half a game at that point in the season. They went to Chicago, won 2 or 3 in Chicago, and won 3 or 4. Excuse me. They started off with 2 or 3 against the White Sox, and 3 or 4 against the Tigers, with a young Jerry Garvin picking up 2 wins. Now they went on a road trip and they were swept by the White Sox in the return series, and then they went on to face the Yankees, winning 2 and losing 2. They came home with a 7-7 record, which is not too bad for a young franchise. But this is when where it went off the rails, ladies and gentlemen, for the rest of the season. And most of Toronto's lineup were rejects from other squads. They only won 47 games the rest of the season, losing 100 to end up with a record of 54 and 107, 45 and a half games behind the world champion, the Reggie Jackson led New York Yankees. Now, the Blue Jays had some minor highlights during the year. They scored on May 4th. They scored 10 runs in the game for its first time by beating the Brewers 10-3 at Exhibition Stadium. They also scored 10 runs 5 nights later on May 9th in a 10-4 win over their expansion cousins, the Seattle Mariners. But Toronto started to really heavily struggle in May. It went going 8-17, and they ended up being an American League seller for the first time yet in a month, and again never came out. Um, Even though they lost their first two games in June, they won five of their next six. But then again, like they were going in mini slumps on a regular basis. Now, in June 10 and 17, at the All Star break, they lost 8 games in a row, and they went 7-21 in July with an overall record of 35 and 66. Um, the They were getting great fan support as well as on August 9th, he broke the single season record for attendance by expansion team by getting 22,450 fans at Venerable Exhibition Stadium, which, if anybody's ever attended Exhibition Stadium, it was a football park made for baseball. And that August 9th victory against the Twins, so, was significant. It was kind of a preamble of Sky Dome and the great Blue Jay fans that showed up on all the pennant drives in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s. Now, September was terrible at the start. They lost 11 straight, breaking the string with a 3-2 win against the Red Sox on September 7th. But on September 10th, big record for the Blue Jays. The very, very dependable Roy Howell drove in 9 runs in a 19-3 win over the New York Yankees at Yankee Stadium. And it was the Yankees' worst loss at home in over a half a century. But of course, later on in the month, it was the famous Earl Weaver game when he was protesting over a tarp being used in the bullpen mounds. E. Weaver took his team off the field, and he lost by 9-0 forfeit. And it marked the first and still only time since 1914 that an MLB team had deliberately forfeited the game. Now, the season came to an end on October 2nd as he split a doubleheader against the Cleveland Indians in front of 27,789 fans, and their total attendance was a very impressive 1.7 million people. And for 81 home starts, that's quite interesting. The Even though the Mariners had a little bit more success in that season, and because Toronto had their first winning season 6 years later, the Mariners were still struggling by 1991 when they posted a 500 record for the first time. Now we must understand this. Like I said, AL East again, Yankees, Orioles, Red Sox, 97 wins or more. The Tigers won 74, Cleveland won 71, and the Brewers won 67. But what was interesting about Toronto that year, they had a better record on the road than they had at home. They won 29 games on the road, 125 at home. And generally, like I said, they had some success against AL East teams. And actually, the best success they had was against Milwaukee by going 7-8. But Minnesota was a thorn in their side. He won 1-9 against Minnesota. Yankees, he won 6 games. Boston, they only won 3. And 77 was quite interesting as well because Paul Hodgson, the Frankton, New Brunswick native, was signed as an amateur free agent on April 14th of that year, and eventually went on to play a few games with Toronto in 1980, which put kind of New Brunswick on the baseball map. But it was before Matt Stairs and Real Cormier and everybody else. And of course, one of the most interesting turn of events, future basketball all-star Danny Ainge, who was considered a two-sport star at the time, was drafted by the Blue Jays in the 15th round of the 77 amateur draft, and eventually had a few cups of coffee with Toronto, but he couldn't bat any more 200. He was talented enough, but not to the level of what they expected for baseball. Now, back for that year, uh, Otto had a great year, 16 homers, 62 RBIs. But Doug Alt, who had two home runs on opening day, 11 home runs, 64 RBI. And but what really stood out is the fact is they had some good up and coming players like Bob Baylor, Rick Cerrone, Ernie Witt, who had a few cups of coffee with the team at the time. But the big draw, of course, and he almost hit 20 home runs that year, was the every experienced former Dodger and Expo star Ron Fairley, who had a great season at DH, hitting 279 with 19 home runs and 64 RBIs. But young prospects like Al Woods and Gary Woods, Roy Hall was there. The pitcher, young Dave Lemanchik, Jerry Garvin, Jim Clancy was there, of course. Singer didn't work out; he ended up 2-8. But in the relief corps, the future star Pete Vukovich had a big year, going 7-7 with 8 saves. Johnson had a consistent year with 2-4 with 5 saves. But generally, like I said, 90% of the players that were on the team would end up being, you know, traded later on or let go. But this is before Toronto picked up such key players as Damaso Garcia, Alfredo Griffin, Frank McGriff, Fred McGriff. Quite a lot of trades with the Yankees through the years. The thing about Toronto in that opening season, you're only getting a glimpse of what the franchise were all about. We all remember to see it. The games on CBC that were quite popular, Don Chevrolet and Whitey Ford announcing the games. Don't know why Dave Van Horn wasn't asked to do the games. Maybe he wants Chevrolet to do it because he's multi-purpose. This was before, of course, the infamous Fergie Oliver showed up to do color with the Blue Jays, which almost turned every viewer off on CTV when Oliver took over. But Don Chevrolet was the voice of the Blue Jays for quite some time, and this is before some key players like Mayberry showed up, and to see Toronto struggle at the first, every expansion team has trouble. But I don't think in 2020, if there was a Major League Baseball expansion team, they would be allowed as much weak players on the squad. More talented players would be allowed. At the time, there was less players from Cuba and the Caribbean that were being brought in. Nowadays, you could fill pretty well the expansion team with Latino players. When the Expos were starting to fade, the late 1990s, early 2000s, you saw that. Um, but what really stood out for me with the Blue Jays that year was the fact is the spirit of the team. It was a seed that was growing, and the OK go Blue Jays go, like the logo, you know. And what really hurt the Blue Jays in that first season, of course, they weren't selling Labatt Blue beer at the park, which is kind of bizarre because the name Blue Jays was accepted, but the problem is the main sponsor of the franchise was Labatt Blue. They were called Blue Jays, and they weren't selling beer at the park. Strange Ontario way of doing things in the late 70s. So if you have a chance, go on YouTube. There's a lot of Blue Jay stuff from that early year, especially it's uh, it's like I said, there's a lot of stuff on YouTube, but you got to understand that most days people don't want to think about that 77 season compared to the success of the 80s, 90s, 2000. There was no Jose Bautista back then. There was no Encarnacion. There was no Reggie Jackson, who kind of flirted with coming to Canada with the Expos. So overall, like I said, the season, it was a B minus. It needed to be done, but when Alfredo showed up, when all these great prospects from the other team showed up in trades, of course, back then Major League Baseball took 2 years to build a franchise. And by 79, 80, 81, you can see the glimmers of hope going on. So, and we're going to talk about that in a later podcast about the late 70s with the Blue Jays. Anyway, I hope this finds you well. Have a good Sunday. Bye.